Masters of martial arts. They exist though they are unknown to society. There are people who excel in martial arts. They use force to maintain order throughout South Korea. And I'm one of them. In the sales area of a grocery store, not far from the cash register, stood a gray-haired, homeless-looking man. Raising his hand in the air, he finished his short narrative, causing boundless confusion and shame to the cashier standing opposite. Well, what was that nonsense? The boy looked at his old grandfather in utter bewilderment. His evening was clearly not going well. That same day, 12 hours ago, the first afternoon classes were just finishing up at the old Chanha school. While the students were still sitting at their desks, there were two guys standing in a small nook near the main building of the school. While one of them was just standing there with his hands in his pockets, the other was making some incomprehensible hand motions in the air. Twisting his palms, clenching and unclenching his fists, the guy in the gray shirt seemed to be fooling around, constantly speaking in an idiotic voice about some divine teachings. "Hyukshan sect!" the hooligan shouted, and then struck a third boy who was in the alley at the time. The impact was so strong that the schoolboy flew a couple of meters away. The debauchee made his partner laugh as he finished the fight like in Mortal Kombat. The latter, grinning at his friend's foolish execution of the blow, asked why he started talking about all kinds of divine arts and why he couldn't just get money from the victim without all this shouting. The joyful bully told his accomplice that if he also watched the TV series Hyukchan Divine Fist, he would probably become a fan of the sect in the show. Suddenly, the dialogue between the two friends was interrupted by a third voice. A boy lying on the ground said that he was also watching this popular TV series. This boy was named Kang haejin. He was a student of the school in question, and he was 18 years old. He got up a little and got down on one knee and told his assailants that Hyukchan's Divine Fist had an interesting plot, but that he had missed most of it because of lack of money. Clenching his fists, he said through gritted teeth that the show was probably exaggerating things compared to real fights, and it was unlikely that anyone would be able to replicate that in real life. After a moment, haejin lunged at one of the attackers. In his head, he visualized one of the moves he had been shown in his MMA class. At the same moment, he shouted to the bully that he didn't stand a chance against real fighting moves. "What the hell are you talking about?" The guy in the short-sleeved shirt asked in bewilderment and had no problem fending off the boy's counterattack by punching him in the face. By inertia, the schoolboy's body flew off again, but this time even farther away. With anger and resentment, the boy looked at his assailant who was mocking him. Looking at Kang haejin lying on the ground, the bully ironically asked him where he got his strength and courage from, if he had once again watched some motivational videos from YouTube. Moving closer to the victim, the vile type looked at the helpless boy with disdain. Shrouded in rage, he began mercilessly pounding the schoolboy, shouting that he was just a dirty and destitute orphan who should behave properly. "If you keep acting like this, I'm going to beat you up even harder!" shouted the bully, who continued to deliver powerful and merciless blows to the guy who tried to fight back. Suddenly, someone from behind suddenly called out to the troublemaker. He turned around a little nervously, looking for the source of the sound. A girl dressed in a brown short skirt and a shirt and jacket stood just above, not far from the stairs opposite. Calmly looking into the bully's eyes, he ordered him to stop immediately. It was Woo Ah-han. She was quite attractive, with a short haircut and eyes the color of the ocean abyss. But now she was looking sternly at the violent types who were beating up the defenseless boy. The bully in the gray shirt was clearly not satisfied with this state of affairs. Calling the girl all sorts of names, he moved towards her, threatening and demanding that she go her own way if she didn't want any more trouble. But at the same moment, his partner blocked his way, trying to stop the conflict. A moment later, a tall, brown-haired tall guy appeared behind Akhan's back. He called out to the troublemakers as he walked, asking what they had just said. This nice-looking young man was Wang Tessen, also a student of Changha High School. He looked at the bullies with a sense of superiority, reminding them that he had already warned them not to bully children. "Would you rather I play with you then? Or would you rather run away from here?" With a sharp change of tone, the boy asked, and looked angrily at the insolent man in the gray shirt. Instantly realizing that they had nothing more to do here, the two hooligans hurried away from the alley. One of them, pushing his accomplice, apologized in every possible way, saying that his friend was just overexcited today. With a sudden change in mood, Tessen ran up to Ahan, asking if she was hurt and if she needed help going to the nurse's station. Without changing her expression, the girl said she wasn't hurt and didn't need help. Tessin walked over to Haejin, who was sitting on the ground, and helped him up. As he shook the dust off the boy, Tessin told him that it was better for him to forget and not think about those guys. Akon, who had stepped aside a bit, suddenly asked the beaten guy why he was messing with those hooligans. The girl looked back at Haejin without a clear answer. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and said that in such a case it was better to let herself be beaten up than to try to prevent it, because otherwise it might end up worse. As she continued, Ahan added that it might be cruel, but it was better to give in sometimes, especially if one's own safety was at stake. Turning around and starting to walk away, she told Haejin one last time that if he didn't like what she just said, he could continue to be a punching bag. Seeing the girl leaving, Taesan hurried after her, suggesting that she go together. The boy continued to sit on the ground. Tessin's desperate attempts to ask Ahan to meet after school and the girl's expected denial, citing busyness, were still coming from around the corner. With confusion and resentment filling all his thoughts, Haejin slammed his fist on his knee. As he struggled to get up and held his battered chest with his right hand, the boy was desperately surprised at Tessin and Ahan's arrogance. He didn't have any money, so why should he bow to some assholes? Clenching his fist, Hagen muttered through his teeth that he already had to plow through his part-time job like a damn man, and whatever money he had left over was going to MMA training. "I'll practice, and I can beat those assholes," the boy said confidently, raising his eyes filled with a thirst for revenge. A few hours later, already in the training room, Haejin heard terrible news from the coach. He suggested that the boy stop training for a while. Thinking that it was the delayed payment, the boy said that he would definitely pay for the lessons, just a little later. The coach explained that after the 6 months that Haejin had been practicing with them, everything was going great. He had no problems with the technicians, and he had some talent. But look at your body. Usually it starts to grow after about 6 months, the mentor said sadly, looking at the boy's skinny and puny body. Stroking his bald head, the trainer stood up and said that despite his persistent efforts, Haejin's body hadn't changed at all since the first session. And even considering his long career, this was the first time he'd encountered something like this. He couldn't explain it. Shrugging his shoulders, the jock replied that it was as if the kid's body didn't want to change its current state. Patting the boy on the shoulder, the mentor said that in any case, further continuation of training seemed to him a waste of time, so he would return the boy's payment for the lessons, since in such a situation, he could not afford to take the money. Not believing what he had just heard, the boy tried to change the coach's mind, saying he would try even harder, but no amount of pleading made a difference. "Haejin, it seems there are endeavors in this world that don't pay off." Trying to stop this meaningless conversation, the mentor said sharply. Those words stabbed into the boy's heart like a knife. Late evening has descended on the streets of a South Korean city. All around, restaurants, cafes, and shopping centers were already preparing to close. However, a convenience store on a not-so-busy street was preparing for the night shift. Haejin squatted between the rows of various foods. The phrase that the coach had told him was still playing in his head. The boy thought that sometimes the teacher gave up first, and it was all about persistence. Trying to find advantages in this situation, Haejin decided that in this case, he could study at home by himself because he had already mastered the program. In this way, he would do the same things and save money as well. As he pondered the decision, the boy also realized that if he worked out between part-time jobs, he would most likely be able to pick up an extra shift. When he looked around and saw that there were no customers in the store yet, he decided to do a set of squatting exercises. Taking a box of refrigerated food as a weight, the guy started doing squats time after time. However, as soon as he sat down for the 4th time, his entire body was suddenly pierced by a sharp pain in several places at once. The sensation was so intense that his eyes went black for a while. Coughing and dropping the crate of groceries to the floor with a clatter, the guy fell to his knees, trying to catch his breath and come to his senses. It wasn't the first time he'd had this pain, but it had been coming more often lately. Haejin clutched his hands to his chest and clutched his shirt, barely holding back the tears that were coming, and thought he needed to take some vitamins. As soon as he thought about it, a man's scream sounded behind the boy's back. Someone was making a loud threat to someone in response to something. Soon a second male voice was heard, clearly apologizing to the first. Haejin decided to look around and see what was going on. When he turned around, he saw three men standing outside the store window. One of them, a tall big man in a white shirt, was holding the hand of the other, a decrepit old man in a green jacket, shouting that the homeless man had stolen something from him. The gray-haired man tried to break free and explain that he hadn't stolen anything from anyone. A third man in a blue suit, standing at a distance, watched the whole scene. "Just get on with it and get on with it!" Laughing, shouted the type who was watching from the sidelines. A moment later, the white-shirted man punched the old man in the face with his left hand. Throwing the older man aside, he buttoned up his outer garment, saying that he just needed to vent all the anger he had accumulated during the day on someone. And this homeless man had just given him an excuse. Turning to his accomplice, the big man jokingly asked his friend whether he should continue beating the old man. The gray-haired man sat on his knees and looked at the hooligans fearfully, begging for mercy. But everything changed a moment later when Haejin ran out into the street with a phone near his ear. Loud enough for the whole street to hear, he announced that two guys were beating up an old man outside a convenience store in Habuk Branch. Afraid of the unexpected, the boy stood at the door of the store, holding it ajar, and finally spoke into the phone for the police to come quickly. After looking at the boy and realizing that it was dangerous to stay here any longer, the hooligans decided to run away immediately. As he ran away, the big man in the white shirt pointed his finger at Hagen and shouted that he remembered him, and they would meet again. Barely surviving the stress of the situation and muttering that such jerks always choose the weak, the boy approached the old man and asked if he was okay. Ignoring the boy's question, the man asked if the boy had really called the police. Pointing to the phone with the broken screen, Haejin said he just pretended and didn't want to call so he wouldn't get in too much trouble or ask questions later. The boy approached the old man and helped him to his feet. The gray-haired stranger thanked the boy, saying that very few people nowadays are willing to help in situations that do not concern them. The kid nodded confidently, saying that he couldn't stand people like those two bastards anyway. Suddenly, Hagen's attention was drawn to the old man's right leg. He was leaning on it very heavily. The boy decided that those hooligans had deliberately hit the man's legs, thinking that he was an easy target, and with his legs knocked out, he would be as defenseless as possible. Suddenly, the stranger's dirty face became sharply cheerful. He looked into the boy's eyes and suddenly asked who his parents were. And so, the story flows smoothly to the moment where it all began. The man stood with his hand up in the air after dumping a bunch of strange, probably unreliable information on Haejin. The story had left the old man out of breath, and now he stood in that pose, recovering his breath. Looking at him, the boy thought that the man had asked him about his parents first, and then suddenly started talking nonsense. He must be crazy. However, whether out of boredom or a sense of duty, Haejin decided to play along with the stranger. A little shyly, he asked why such an amazing man was walking around the streets dirty and in rags. After getting some air, the old man turned around, raised his hand solemnly and replied that he was on the run. After a short pause, he decided to continue the story. From what he said, there were various martial arts factions in the past. But nowadays, there are only 3 of them left in South Korea. The royal company uses martial arts for aggression and control of the underworld. A new religious group called Shinshin Religion that believes in God and follows him as their leader, and an unofficial government organization commonly referred to as the Emperor. They oversee and control martial arts affairs. The old man sadly cast his eyes downward, and without hope in his voice, he said that without any warning, the 3 factions had joined together to suppress the smaller alliances. Continuing to tell the story, he said that the faction he was a member of had also merged into a separate alliance. Almost immediately, however, their association was caught in a cycle of endless battles and intrigue. Betrayals, the deaths of their closest friends, and then the agony that overtook their faction. Like many other unions, they were unable to do anything about the sheer power of the 3 organizations. The old man himself barely survived and hid from persecution for more than a decade. Raising his eyes and looking at the kid across from him, he explained that it was because of everything that had happened to him that he had been wary when the kid had mentioned the police, as it could attract the attention of those 3 factions and lead to more trouble for him. "Ah, that's it!" Looking away from the old man, Haejin said. At that moment, he still thought that this strange stranger was just out of his mind and just deep into his own delusional world. Continuing to play along with the madman, the boy asked if it was right to tell someone like him. someone who was hearing about something so important for the first time. But the old man interrupted the boy, reminding him that he still hadn't answered his question. With a serious look on Haejin's face, the stranger asked the question about the boy's parents again. Interestingly enough, there wasn't a bit of madness in the stranger's eyes. He looked like a man in the prime of his mind, who had seen a lot of things in his life. Realizing that there was no point in fooling around any further, the boy replied that he knew nothing about his parents, as they had died when he was still small. Already irritated by the strange old man's behavior, the boy asked why the stranger was asking him about his parents. At the same time, a jade-colored shroud enveloped the gray-haired man's eyes. Suddenly, he reached out to Haejin and touched 2 fingers to his chest. The amazed boy watched the old man in a stupor. He almost immediately removed his hand and said that the boy's meridians were blocked. When Haejin asked what meridians were, the stranger said that they were the paths through which ki energy flowed in the human body. Showing his body, the stranger said that even a normal person had at least a few meridians open, but the boy had them completely blocked. The old man suggested that someone had blocked them from the outside. The guy asked in bewilderment how the chi energy was related to what the man had said earlier. However, the stranger did not answer the question, saying something about 6 months. At Hagen's questioning look, he replied that he knew that even though the boy was working out hard, his body wasn't changing at all. This information, which only he could know, shocked the boy. Continuing, the stranger muttered that the body should grow when ki energy is flowing, but with the blocked meridians, Haejin would not be able to grow, and vice versa, putting the body under unnecessary stress. The boy's mind flashed back to a recent bout of pain. At this moment, the old man foresaw that the boy seemed to be beaten regularly, and at this rate, any exercise, even the smallest one, would cause him unbearable pain. And if he continued to torture his body like this, soon the ki energy would flow in the opposite direction, leading to death. With a serious look in the boy's eyes, the old man said that he could guess the situation the boy was in. But is this situation more important than life? At the end of his monologue, the gray-haired man offered the child 2 options: either give up or find another way. After all, there are efforts in this world that are better not to resort to. Haejin was surprised. For the second time in a day, he heard the same thing from different people. Thinking back on everything that had happened to him not too long ago, the boy realized that he wasn't a born fighter, and it would be easier to give up than to suffer like this. Suddenly, the guy slammed his hand on the table and looked at the old man. "But I didn't get a proper family education, so I didn't learn how to give up in time," Haejin muttered with fury in his eyes. As he continued to stand his ground, the boy said that he would definitely become stronger and crush all his enemies. And since he had made this decision, no one had any right to stop him. At this time, the stranger stood, eyes downcast, and scrutinized the dirty hand of the young cashier. "I'm going to follow this path anyway, so either help me or just forget about it," Haejin finished, keeping his gaze on the old man. The gray-haired man had not moved once during the boy's monologue. All this time he'd been staring at the guy's unwashed palm like that. The thought flashed through Hagen's mind that he was standing there arguing with some homeless man. Gathering his thoughts, he made an official look and said that if the old man was having a hard time, he could call for an ambulance. At that very second, the mysterious stranger took the guy's hand. "Well, it looks like there's no other way out," the weirdo said calmly, in response to Hagen's pleas to let go of his hand. His image changed dramatically. With a reproachful tone, he said that he had seen hundreds of times such people who are ready to torture themselves indefinitely. Such people go on and on until their bodies finally collapse. Taking the boy's other hand, the old man muttered that he didn't like all this, but if he left it as it was, the kid would continue to abuse himself until he died. Finally, calmly looking Haejin in the eye, the stranger said that he would now open his meridians. In response to the boy's panicked screams, the gray-haired man sternly ordered him not to move and to stand still. Looking menacingly at the kid, the old man added that he should not make any noise. After a moment, they exchanged handshakes. Then, the stranger bowed his head over the table as if he was very tired. Haejin still stood motionless, trying not to make a sound. After a few seconds, the old man picked up his cane. Complaining that he hadn't used ki energy for a long time and was tired so quickly. With that, he headed for the exit of the supermarket. Just before the door, he said that he hoped the boy would feel much better now. Haejin was still standing there, holding his left arm. Feeling nothing but intense disappointment, the boy remained standing like that until the silhouette of the old man receded and disappeared into the depths of the dark alleys. After another few long hours, the guy's shift at the convenience store came to an end. Thanking himself that he'd managed to endure another stretch of work, Haejin strode down the corners of the street, away from the store. The thought that the world he lived in was huge, and there were so many fucked up people in it. Key meridians, it's like something out of a martial arts manhwa. I'm living in the 21st century, for crying out loud. The boy thought as he turned the corner into a dark corridor of endless houses. He was trying to figure out how everything had come to be the way his life had turned out. But in the next instant, a heavy male arm blocked his path, slung over his shoulder from behind. Haejin realized that he was once again in trouble. "Now, you just wait a little while, kid. It'll all be over soon. I told you we'd meet again, didn't I?" said a gruff male voice. When the boy looked up, he saw the two hooligans who had recently beaten up the old man outside the store. The big man in the blue business suit, smiling, approached his partner and asked cheerfully what was wrong. He grabbed Hagen by the neck. The guy in the gray shirt laughed and said that he was obviously a nerd, even though he was trying to fight back. Trying to get out of the bully's grip, the boy listened to the bully ironically asking him if he was tired of living a righteous life. Squeezing the victim's neck harder and harder, the creep told him that they realized almost immediately that the police call was fake. He smirked and said happily that he enjoyed ripping off the small and defenseless like Haejin the most. But a moment later, the boy caught the bulky man's finger with his free hand and snapped it. The bully instantly knelt down and grabbed his hand. The index finger of his right hand throbbed violently with growing pain. Meanwhile, Haejin assumed a fighting stance and laughed with a smile on his face, surprised that the bastard was complaining about just one broken finger. Separately, the guy noted that it was incredibly funny how these two assholes were running away from a police force that didn't exist. Without restraining himself, the big man in the gray shirt shouting obscene words at Hagen rushed to attack the boy. The guy, on the other hand, calmed himself and decided to concentrate on the actions and movements of the thug. The hero decided to choose the tactic of playing on the counterattack. When the bully approaches and almost hits him, the guy should dodge and immediately hit back. After waiting for a moment, Haejin swung to strike his opponent directly in the face. However, as soon as he wanted to launch his attack, something happened that he had never felt in his past fights. It was as if time around him had practically stopped. He felt completely free to act. It seemed to him that the opponent opposite him simply stood still. At the same instant, small pulses ran down his arm like a chain. It was probably the Kuyi energy running along the meridians. His arm was covered in several small bursts of energy, which felt like it lightened his arm considerably and sped up the impact. At that moment, the boy realized that this would be the first fight of his life that he would finally win. The thugs, who had never seen anything like this before, recoiled in horror at the unknown phenomenon. But there was no avoiding the hit. A powerful explosive force hit the bully in the gray shirt standing in front of him. But the force of the impulse was so great that the guy in the blue suit behind him was also thrown back by the blast wave. The blaze from this attack was so strong that it could be seen from across the block. When the dust cloud that followed the impact dissipated, Haejin could finally see the results of the phenomenon he had managed to reproduce. At the other end of the alley, two ruffians lay without any sign of life. Both of them had had parts of their clothing torn to shreds by the force of the blast. The boy himself was standing like a stumbling block in the same place. His face expressed complete bewilderment and denial of what had happened. The sleeve of the right hand that had struck him was torn to the shoulder. "So, are you feeling better now?" came an unexpected voice from behind me. To Hagen's great horror, the same crazy old man was standing behind him. Panicking, he tried to turn around, but quickly realized he couldn't. The realization of this fact further increased the tension that was already over the edge. The mysterious stranger asked the kid if he liked the power and if he now believed in chi and the existence of martial arts. As soon as he said that, the same jade-colored energy aura immediately began to form around the old man's feet again. "You're still inexperienced, though." "Well, it's only natural," the madman said, turning around and looking toward the end of the alley. Haejin was uneasy about the smoke enveloping the strange weirdo. He was also frightened by the fact that the old man's leg was almost broken, and now he was walking calmly without even leaning on his cane. Suddenly, the gray-haired man grinned and said that he must be behaving indecently, since he still hadn't introduced himself. I am Park Jangan, the leader of the Beggars Union, the old man said solemnly. But to most, he is better known as the General. Trying to stop the pathos pouring from the old man's mouth, Haejin called out to the man. Jangun turned around and looked at the boy. The boy was still standing in the same pose in which he had knocked out the bullies. He said he couldn't move his body. Blue energy was still oozing from his hands. The general walked leisurely over to the boy and in one fell swoop hoisted his body onto his shoulder. You're tired from releasing too much ki energy, the old man muttered. Glancing over his shoulder, he added that it would be best for Haejin to rest now, to gather his strength and not worry too much about everything that had happened. Moving in the direction of the alley exit, Jangan asked the boy where he lived to help him get home. This question made the boy a little wary. He replied evasively that he lived alone and had nothing to steal. The general was irritated by this formulation. The next moment, Haejin felt a sharp, intense pain in the area below his lower back. He shouted at the courtyard in surprise. It turned out that the old man had pressed him on an acupuncture point on one of his buttocks. Because of too much simultaneous energy release, the boy's body had a hard time tolerating any physical action, especially that which was directed at the meridians. Listening to the boy's pleas for forgiveness, the general thought, replaying the situation with the fight in his head again. In any case, it had only been a few hours since he had opened the boy's meridians, yet they were already so strong. Surely, this child must have had much more potential than Park Jungwon could have expected. At dawn, a crowd of people, mostly consisting of school children, crowded around the very alley where the fight between the hooligans and Hagen had taken place the previous night. A lot of laughter could be heard in the crowd of gawkers. Some were trying to find out through acquaintances what had happened here. Others were looking at the bodies lying there and assuming that they were just another drunkard who had drunk himself to oblivion. The boldest jokingly compared the two motionless bodies to sacred paintings, as both men had their arms crossed on their stomachs. "God, that's disgusting!" shouted some girl. Many people filmed what happened on their phones. Wu A-han was among those who happened to see the bodies of the two drunks. She asked her friend, who was holding her hand, if she had seen enough and if they could finally leave. A-han's gaze was fixed on the men lying there. Something, though, was causing some wariness and suspicion. Although there were no obvious cuts, wounds, or bruises on their bodies, their shirts were torn as if they had been in the epicenter of an explosion. Their completely blank eyes were wide open on faces that expressed absolute horror. These two men clearly could not have lain down in this place by themselves. Looking to the end of the alleyway, A-han thought that surely these two must have been dragged away from the depths of the nook by someone so they could be easily detected. Before the girl could think about it, a measured, loud stomping sounded behind her. An unpleasant chill ran down the schoolgirl's back. She felt the presence of someone dangerous and powerful behind her. A man with an unusual hair color and wearing dark sunglasses pushed through the crowd and made his way closer to the epicenter of the event. Akan noticed that this strange man was much taller than any man she had ever met. The black business suit complemented the austere image of a serious and determined man. Staring at the back of the stranger's head, the girl speculated as to why he might be so interested in two drunks lying in strange poses in an early morning alleyway. The mysterious man stood in front of the bodies and studied them intently without making a sound. Akan looked around when she sensed something wrong. Her senses did not fail her this time. The guy with the glasses wasn't alone. Around the crowd, as if at the snap of a finger, several similarly unusual people in business suits appeared at once. Some of them were hurriedly talking on the phone, others were standing with their backs to the scene, as if waiting for someone or guarding something. Han, what are you thinking about again?" unexpectedly interrupted the silence of the schoolgirl's friend. The girl, keeping her eyes on the strange people, evasively replied that nothing terrible had happened, and she was just thinking about today's test. Realizing that A-han had some strange thoughts again, her friend suggested that she go to school, to which the girl agreed. Meanwhile, Haejin had a terrible dream. He dreamt of the night before. The events that had happened were succeeding each other. The boy was exactly reliving all his actions all over again. At some point, he was almost convinced that the whole situation was not real, and that it was just another delirious dream on the background of fatigue. At that moment, however, he dreamed of the general. In the same instant, Haejin woke up in a cold sweat, screaming that he remembered everything. The boy saw his humble apartment. There was no one around but him. Getting out of bed, the boy thought that he and the old man should have come home together. Surprised that he was alone in the room, Haejin decided that the general had just carried him home and left. The thought made the schoolboy a little sad. Thinking that he still had something to ask the older man, he tried to get to his feet. But immediately his eyes darkened, and it was not so easy to keep his balance. Unable to stay on his feet, the boy fell to his knees, groaning in pain and weakness. But even so, his body refused to obey. As his head hit the floor, Haejin realized that not only were his legs unable to hold his weight, but his spine had weakened as well. Sweat dripped down his throat, and he realized that every effort, even the smallest, was difficult. It felt as if his heart might explode at any moment. Leaning on one arm and taking his chest with the other, Haejin looked around himself. At that moment, his consciousness left his body for a while. For a moment, it seemed to him that he was flying in infinite space, and his body was as light as a feather. At the same time, his eyes were presented with an incomprehensible bluish mist flying before his eyes. After a couple more seconds, consciousness returned to him, and Haejin opened his eyes, seeing the ceiling of his apartment again. Still in a half-delirious state, the boy thought he was lying on a soft pillow and didn't understand why his body hurt so much. However, having fallen into darkness again, Haejin woke up in the position in which he had passed out. The boy touched his chest, which was incredibly well pumped, to see if he was dreaming. The boy jumped to his feet and was horrified to find that his body had changed dramatically overnight. His abdomen was adorned with 6 perfect six-pack abs, the perfect figure accompanied by strong muscles all over his body. Raising his right arm, Haejin didn't recognize it either. The perfect shape was accompanied by powerful veins from wrist to elbow. Once again, falling to his knees under the weight of his new body, the boy continued to stare at his limbs, not timing what was happening. At that moment, the thought came to him that, after all, it wasn't the most important thing right now. As soon as he thought about it, a strange and frightening haze began to ooze from his right ear. This blue substance was very similar to the energy that had first helped his blow to become many times stronger, and then shackled his body, preventing him from moving. "It's called ki," said a familiar old voice from the direction of the front door. Clamping his ears tightly with fear, Haejin raised his head and looked forward. The general stood at the entrance with his hood pulled over his head. As soon as he entered the apartment, he ordered the boy to stop making noise, so as not to attract unnecessary attention. He waved his cane and told the boy to sit down so that he could finally explain everything. On the new day, Jangen's face was not as kind as it had been the previous night. On the contrary, his face had taken on the features of a mentor, and his eyes looked sternly at the boy. Quickly jumping up from the floor, Haejin ran up to the old man in a rage. Shouting and pointing at his face, the boy irritably asked the gray-haired man if it was all his doing. Pointing his fingers at the body, the schoolboy continued to ask what the general had done to him while he slept. Jangun looked at Haejin's muscles with equal amazement. He said in amazement that he had no idea what could have happened, or how the boy could have grown so much in one night. Asking the young man to turn around, the general placed his hand on his back. At the same moment, the hand began to emit chi energy, and a greenish light poured out of the palm. The old man stated that the schoolboy's blood circulation was normal and there was nothing to worry about. Once again, Haejin persisted in asking what the old man had done to him last night. The irritated man replied that he himself had just returned and had not seen the boy since he had personally brought him home in his arms. "Then how is that possible?" the boy asked grudgingly, looking over his shoulder and showing a muscular arm. As he tensed up, energy began to pour out of his ears with renewed vigor. The old man stared at the incredible transformation with utter incomprehension. He had never experienced anything like it, and there could be only one explanation. Because the guy's meridians were blocked, the body had not changed under any influences over time. Now that the guides for Kiwi energy had been opened, the muscular changes had begun. As for the appearance itself, the reason for the dramatic muscle growth was not because the meridians had become open. The thing was that the boy himself was training tirelessly, despite the complete lack of results. That was why it could be said that Haejin had achieved the body transformation by himself. "You really worked hard," the old man finished. At this thought, even more QE energy began to be released from the guy's ears. Having finished with the praise, the general suddenly realized that the boy had grown about 20 centimeters during the night, which he was surprised at, considering how short the schoolboy had been only a day before. In response to Haejin's embarrassment, Jang-gun changed the subject again, saying that after he carried the kid to the apartment, he went to clean up his tracks because there were too many after him. The general reminded him to use martial arts as carefully as possible, otherwise he could get caught by the leading factions. If you leave too bright a trail, the faction's bloodhounds will definitely attack, and then it will only be a matter of time before Hagen is caught by the king, god, or emperor. Without a shadow of irony, Jangan looked into the boy's eyes and said seriously that he should not show his body to other people for a while. When Haejin asked why this was so, the general replied that until the guy learned to control ki energy, he would leave his footprints everywhere. And those guys from strong factions would quickly track him down. Tired of the blue smoke constantly oozing through his ears, the boy clapped them shut, desperately asking if they couldn't just be plugged with some kind of earmuffs or headphones. But as soon as he covered his ears, chi began to ooze out through his nostrils. When he couldn't think of anything better to do, he irritably tried to plug his nose. But at the same moment, energy began to come out from somewhere in his pants. Janggong asked Haejin not to panic, as he would help him gain full control over his chi. "That's right. I, General, will take care of your training myself." The old man turned his back to the boy and filled the space around him with his own energy. Without stopping trying to stop the ki from entering his body, Haejin suddenly asked the gray-haired man why he called himself a general. When he received silence instead of an answer, he said that he was old enough to be told about gods, emperors, kings, and generals. Jonggun said that he would tell him all about it now. The case took place in Seoul in the year 1962, on the outskirts of a poor suburb. On that day, Beggars Union leader Kim Ju-bon, after checking in with everyone gathered, said that the world is going through a major change involving many people and circumstances. Their faction, in order to adapt to the new reality, needed to keep up and be reborn into the new culture. And that required a lot of changes. On that day, the current General Park Jang-gun was only 8 years old, but he was already listening attentively to the words of the union leader. And the first innovation Kim Ju-bon decided to implement was changing the title leader to general. The solemnity with which the leader presented this not the most significant news at first threw the followers into a kind of stupor. However, after a few seconds, everyone as one in voice shouted that this news is great, and the faction welcomes their general to the new title. There is a very deep meaning behind it, not a leader but a general. Kim Ji-boon admired himself. However, no one could know that the faction leader had simply read epic poetry about war, and there was no meaning behind the new title. The Hwasun clan were the first of the union's partners to recognize the beggars. The faction delegate reported to the clan leader that the new title would be used in all official documents from now on, and the general requested that it be included in all treaties. The head of the family turned to one of his subordinates and asked how the word Hwasun was translated into English. After a bit of thought, the employee carrying the pile of papers replied that it translates to volcano in English. "Then call your chief Vulcan from today!" shouted the chief angrily. And so on down the line. The next group to use a new title for their leader was the Mudon clan. Their leader now called himself Shaman. Trailing behind, the head of the Haenam clan called himself Ocean. Thus, more and more factions changed the titles of their leaders to their English counterparts. "That's how the unspoken tradition came to be," finished the general. Haejin smirked and said that this was all quite unusual and even strange. The boy was still sitting on the floor, trying to control the ki crawling out of every crevice. After getting up from the floor, Jang-gun advised the boy to move more slowly and not to rush into anything. The old man's words terrified Haejin. He remembered that he had to go to school right away. Barely having time to ask what time it was, the guy received a powerful blow to the jaw, after which he passed out and did not regain consciousness for a long time. He woke up after a while. The ki energy was still flowing through the cracks, but the air in the room was more humid. Unable to turn his head, the boy looked around the unfamiliar dark room, which looked like a corridor with red lamps hanging from the ceiling. It was quite cool in this place. The last thing Haejin remembered was the moment the old man stabbed him in the chest with 2 fingers. Suddenly, someone appeared in front of the boy, greatly frightening the schoolboy. Standing half in the dark, the stranger ordered the boy to get up, since he was already awake. This place is one of the Beggars Union's secret hideouts. No one knows of its existence. You will be safe here, uttered the mysterious stranger, still without lighting up his face. Trying to discern who was talking to him, Haejin heard someone say that he had promised to help completely take control of key energy in the morning. As soon as he said it, the unknown man stepped out of the shadows. It was still the general, as the boy had expected. But this time he had changed into neater clothes, and in his right hand he held not a cane, but a real bamboo staff. The old man walked over a little and said that he would help the boy until he learned how to hide his key perfectly. But unexpectedly, Jangan set a serious condition. If Haejin failed to master his internal energy, he would stay in this dungeon forever. So harsh and uncompromising a condition caused the kid an inordinate shock. The only thing he thought about at that moment was whether this was his reward for perfect school attendance. 2 days later, Seoul continues to live its usual measured life. "Ah yes, Thane is the best. Tan is just beautiful," muttered a blue-haired girl in sunglasses. It was lunchtime, and the pretty girl in the business suit was munching away on a delicious macaroni, drinking a soda. As she continued the conversation, she explained to her partner sitting next to her that finding a martial artist without any evidence or clues was not an easy task. He calmly replied that orders were orders, without taking his eyes off the phone. As she sipped her soda thoughtfully, she noted that as soon as Namgung had been in this situation, he had started giving out similar tasks. Sighing, she complained that she missed the old days. Her partner coldly replied that those days were gone, and they would have to accept the harsh reality. The picture of the two murdered hooligans popped into the mind of the female agent. Turning to her colleague, she asked what he thought about the death sentence for those two guys. After all, when you think about it, it was very much like being struck by martial arts. The guy with the phone calmly replied that it was unlikely that the masters were involved, since there were no traces of energy at the site. And Ki wasn't easy to get rid of, since if it was traceable anyway. Saying that he had finally cleaned up, the fellow agent stood up. The girl asked him if there was no evidence left at the crime scene at all. After looking around the city street, the type in the business suit replied that among those martial artists who had survived to this day, there were hardly any who would use their ki so recklessly. In particular, inexperienced guys probably wouldn't do that, because then they would be easily caught. The girl agent agreed with these statements. Leaning back and looking up at the sky, she wondered where the damn old man general was hiding after all. "Has he ascended to heaven? Or has he gone to the bottom?" the beauty jokingly questioned herself. None of them knew that an unknown aura had been watching them from the ventilation shaft for several minutes now. Blue haze flew down the narrow corridors, snaking through the basements toward the sewers. Turning in the direction of the hanging red lights, Aura was approaching the main target. Upon reaching the gray-haired old man standing at his back, the haze stopped and lingered in place. "Fully unleash your aura!" Crossing his arms over his chest, the general ordered. In the next instant, streams of energy fused together, and Haejin appeared against Jang-gun, standing with his arms spread out. This test was one of the most difficult, and that's why sweat began to flow from the guy at the end of the transformation. Looking contentedly at his disciple, the general ordered the student to try to fully release his ki. Without a second's hesitation, the boy raised his arms, and streams of energy rushed in different directions with great speed, fluttering Jangan's gray hair. Admiringly, the old man examined his subordinate, hardly believing that he had managed to realize such potential in such a short period of time. The energy streams, rapidly spreading through the air, reached the red lamps on the ceiling. In addition to splitting his own body, Haejin also learned how to control the waves of his ki. Clenching his left fist, he took control of the energy flow and amplified it. The new outburst caused some of the bulbs to burst. After assessing the result of the work he had done, the general called the boy over and told him that he apparently had nothing more to teach him in terms of controlling his ki. Without turning around, Haejin asked if he could finally walk. However, immediately, without waiting for his mentor's reply, the guy turned around and shouted that this was all some kind of madness. "Why did you keep me in the sewers for 2 whole months?" yelled the boy. His memory flashed back to his first 9-hour herbalism class, where he would immediately get hit on the legs with a stick for improper body positioning. The next unpleasant memory was of meditating among hundreds of cockroaches and rats and then eating them. Falling to his knees, Haejin began beating his hands on the floor and shouting that he had almost been recognized as the store's employee of the month. And now, because of the long absence, he might be fired altogether. After all, a sick leave only lasts a week, not 2 months. Clutching his hands to his head and clutching his hair, he almost cried, thinking about how he would live without any paycheck. In the meantime, the general came quietly up behind him. Taking the boy by the shoulder, he looked him in the eye. Haejin thought for a moment that Jang-gun was about to give him another piece of advice. However, the old man, without any compassion, squeezed the boy by the area between his neck and shoulder so hard that the boy twisted in pain. The general asked the boy how he dared to speak so insolently to his mentor, to which he begged him to stop hurting him. In response, Jang-gun said that what he was doing didn't hurt that much, and in the next instant he pressed another spot, which made Haejin yell even harder. Looking at the screaming kid, the old man couldn't understand anything. It had always been thought that it took at least a year to train in ordinary ki control, and even 5 years if one lacked talent. And even though it's the basics of martial arts, it doesn't mean it's easy. But this kid had mastered the basics of the drill in just 2 months, and such a development was a bit frightening to Jang-gun. Meanwhile, Haejin had already gotten used to the pain of the grip and even asked for more pressure. After a couple minutes, the boy stood up and rubbed his neck and said that he had to go to school right away or he could be in serious trouble. Rubbing his sweatshirt in his hands, the general asked the boy why he was going to school. Was it to catch up with the curriculum, or was there some other reason? Haejin hesitated and tried to lie, saying that he had to go to university after school, so he had to try harder. But the old man understood and threw himself at the boy from behind. Grabbing his student's head with one hand and punching his neck with the other hand, the teacher shouted for him not to dare lie to him anymore. Desperately yelling, Haejin begged to just let him rest for a while. Immediately letting the kid go and grinning, Jang-gun said that he wasn't going to stop him since the kid wouldn't listen to him anyway. Still, the general once again warned Haejin not to dare use his powers in public, but the boy replied that he remembered everything. Immediately, the schoolboy stood up and asked his mentor not to worry, because he wouldn't need strength to beat up those guys. On the same day, further action developed again near Chanha High School. In the same alley where Hagen had been beaten not long ago, the sounds of fighting could be heard again. "Hyukchan clan!" the bully shouted, and threw the lowly boy to the other end of the alley with a powerful right punch. The big man's partner stood aside with a cell phone and grinned, asking when he was going to get bored with the show. An excited guy in a white shirt asked the boy lying on the ground when he would give him his wallet. After getting the wallet, the scoundrel in the gray hoodie started extracting money from it, saying that it used to be fun to beat up that kid, to which his accomplice agreed. Taking out the bills, the partners were discussing who they would beat up next time, when suddenly they were shouted at from the direction of the stairs. Turning around, the bullies saw a man wearing a hooded sweatshirt. Haejin stood in front of them with a band-aid glued to his face. Looking down at the bastards, he asked if they were tired of doing the same thing after 2 months. Both villains recognized the boy. Grinning, they noted that he had grown a little in that short time. "Anyway, welcome back. As a welcome back, we're going to kick your ass," muttered the guy in the white shirt. But he didn't have time to say anything else. After a moment, Haejin Lightning ran a few meters to the bully and swung a powerful blow to his head. The scoundrel's face instantly turned into a bloody mess. His eyes blurred, and he lost consciousness. The attack was so coordinated at one point that the villain's body didn't go anywhere. On the contrary, he immediately fell without making a sound. Haejin exhaled after the punch and stopped. After his grueling training with the general, a single blow was no problem for him. Raising his head, he looked at the bully's partner, who was panicking his head around, thinking of the best way to escape. Grinning at his opponent's helplessness, the hooded guy said that he had just shown him how to use the Hyukchan clan's technique. Looking down at the former hunter, now a victim, with contempt, he said that there was little practical use in real life for the punching techniques used in the TV series. After all, when he tried it out, he realized that there were too many unnecessary actions in the moves from the movies. The other bully watched the tall guy in horror and didn't understand what had happened to him or how he had changed so drastically. Looking at the bulky man with a pile of muscles ready to kill him, the rogue couldn't believe that the man in front of him was the same Kang Haejin. "Are you going to start it yourself, or shall I start it first?" the hooded big man asked hatefully, but that bully answered nothing and continued to stand still without a word. Realizing that he could act freely from here on, Haejin cartoonishly made motions like the Hyukchan clan TV series. Completing the combination, he was already anticipating a long-awaited victory over his offenders. The bastard who was on his feet began to scream and apologize, but the choice had already been made. Haejin swung his left arm and punched his opponent in the stomach with a swing, knocking him back against the wall. The bully, who had fallen to the ground, was still conscious for some time. Tears were streaming from his eyes. After a couple of moments, however, he did pass out. The wallet, which they had taken from the boy who had been lying on the ground the whole time, slipped out of his hands after the blow. Noting that this was easier than he had anticipated, Haejin squatted down. Picking up the purse from the ground, he said that these bastards were still getting themselves at those that looked weaker than them. Standing up to his full height, the guy tossed his wallet to the schoolboy. Looking at the boy calmly, Haejin said that he could go and not worry. And it would be good if he didn't tell the teachers about what had happened here. The child, thanking his rescuer, ran away from the scene, leaving the guy in the hoodie alone with the bodies of the hooligans. After standing and thinking, Haejin realized that he had accomplished his main goal. He had caught the offenders. What to do next he couldn't think of. After examining the unconscious hooligans, he realized that he might have overdone it and beaten them too badly. In any case, it was not a good idea to just leave them here now. So he would have to hide them somewhere. "What's this all about?" A woman's voice behind him interrupted his musings. Hagen turned toward the stairs in horror. Wu Wei-han stood to the other side, with a disgruntled expression on her face as always, and her hands in her jacket pockets. Looking sternly at the boy, the girl wondered what had happened here again. At the same time, it was the height of the day in Seoul. Small clouds floated over the houses where interesting things were happening. "Ugh, it feels good to get outside. The fresh air is just beautiful," General Park Jong-gun exclaimed, walking along the roof with his pole. He was imitating the daily exercise that almost any Korean retiree does. However, his mind was on Kang Haejin. If he thought rationally, the general should have stopped the kid, even if he had to knock him out to do it. The old man remembered the face of his young apprentice. It was undoubtedly the most talented master he had ever known. "Hey, if it were that simple, I wouldn't be able to survive," the general said, looking up at the clouds passing by. Contemplating the celestial blue, he realized that there was nothing he could do except that this boy was still his disciple. The old man thought that he would have to help Haejin anyway. Suddenly, the door opened behind him. Suddenly, the agents of the leading factions came out onto the roof, discussing that the general had indeed fled abroad, and their search for him in South Korea was futile. But then, they noticed a gray-haired man standing with his back to them. "Long time no see, Namgung's youngsters," the green-jacketed man said, turning to the people who had entered the rooftop. Instantly, the group recognized the old man as General Park Jong-gwang. Everyone in the squad was confused for a moment, none of them realizing how this was possible. The head of the group ordered to prepare for the attack, to which the old man laughed, saying that the boys were making a hasty fuss. In the same instant, he surveyed his potential opponents rather calmly and ominously. A moment later, a huge pillar of light pierced the clear daytime sky, and the surroundings became dark for a while. The general radiated incredible energy, literally blowing his opponents off their feet. The squad leader glared angrily at Jong-gun, but he couldn't move from the airflow created by the energy blast. Feeling total superiority and looking arrogantly at his opponents, the general suddenly asked if these people were getting along well with the king. The old man stood in front of the squad, surrounded by an energy vortex. Smirking, he asked with a sneer, "Is it so honorable to grovel before the king?" The general's words caused the leader of the group to become inordinately furious. The reinforcements that came running to help also didn't expect to see the legendary Park Jang-gun on that rooftop. Ironically, the old man said that now there were more people, and the show could begin. At the same second, the squad leader rushed out of his seat to attack. With his katana out of its sheath, he intended the speed of his attacks to decide the outcome of the battle. Spreading out, the blue-haired thug jumped and, using the heavenly sword technique, activated the Heaven Strike ability, which dealt several dozen swift blows to the general. However, the result of the attack made the usually calm group leader stunned by what he saw. With his pole, the old man fended off all his blows and remained completely unharmed. Mocking his rival, Jong-gun noted that Namgung's faction had become even stronger during this time. Unable to handle the emotional pressure, the squad leader shouted that he was requesting support from headquarters. The girl agent stopped the leader, ordering the member standing next to her to call for backup. Pulling out his phone, the type in the business suit shouted to the others to pounce on the old man together. But no sooner had he said it than a powerful blow from the pole struck him in the palm of his hand. Pressing his opponent's hand into his own chest, the general managed to smash the phone in this way as well. Soaring gracefully above his opponent, Jongun muttered that it wouldn't work that way. Such a lightning fast, barely visible to the eye dash from one end of the roof to the other, amazed everyone in the squad. Tucking his staff into the chest of a fallen, unconscious member of the group, the general stood looking at the girl agent who had lost her balance. A couple seconds later, the old man found himself completely surrounded with sword-wielding men. Looking around at the thugs gathered around him, Jangan smiled and said that he was nowhere near as young as he had been in his best years. But if the fighting continued, the consequences for the squad would be disastrous. Nevertheless, the group's leaders remained determined to finally solve the long-standing problem. In that case, you all have to take the old man into consideration. Please be gentle, Jangan said calmly, unwinding his staff. The squad members pounced on the general from different directions in an instant, hoping to finally deal with him once and for all. Suddenly, the old man concentrated energy into his staff. The strength of his ki was so unimaginable that the staff began to bend in various places under the pressure of the incredibly powerful pulses. The general swung the pole and slammed it into the floor, causing a titanic release of energy. An explosion of colossal power shook the buildings within a few blocks, and a greenish flash appeared above the roof of the house where the battle was taking place. And at the same moment, in the courtyard of Chanha Wu Ahan High School, Haejin sternly asked what had happened here. Feeling extremely uncomfortable, and at the same time trying not to reveal his physical changes, the guy sat down and, pretending not to understand anything, thought how best he could escape from here. The girl's gaze was both stern and at the same time incredibly suspicious. The boy's gaze was pulled as far away as possible and looked for ways to escape in every possible way. The tense silence was broken by Wang Tessin, who approached. Calling out to Wu Ahan, the boy happily rushed over to reprimand the school's troublemakers once again. Peeking around the corner, he found the girl standing and looking at a type in a hoodie sitting on his lap. Moving closer, Wang Tessin recognized the seated boy as Kang haejin. "Yo, long time no see, guys. The last 2 whole months, huh?" The schoolboy said, nervous and pulling his hoodie tighter and tighter over his face. Wang Tai-sung replied that he remembered that Haejin had been sick for 2 months. Wu Ahan added that on top of that, he had changed a lot in such a short period of time. Finally, losing his temper, the boy laughed, saying that maybe he had changed a little. Trying to find an excuse, he said that he had actually recently changed gyms, and the new place was great, and that his body was finally starting to show great progress after hard training. "Really?" Wu Ahan asked without a shred of confidence. Trying his best not to reveal his true size, Haejin confirmed that he had told the purest truth. Suddenly, he jumped up and quickly ran around the corner, shouting that he had forgotten to talk to the teacher and that he had to run to the teacher's room and then he could talk to the boys. After following the fleeing idiot with a glance, Wang Tessin said that the world really knows how to surprise. Wu Ahan, on the other hand, didn't say a word. She looked around at the unconscious schoolchildren lying on the ground. It was strange that this was the second similar beating of hooligans in 2 months in the same neighborhood. But the most unusual thing in this story was that in the first case, the fight took place right before Hagen's mysterious illness, and in the second, right after his unexpected transformation and recovery. All these facts were beginning to worry Wu Ahan greatly. After reaching the teacher's lounge, Haejin found his supervisor. After discussing his supposed illness with him, the boy received permission to return to school. The teacher, not taking his eyes off the phone, advised the student to study diligently and try to catch up with his classmates in terms of study materials. Ordering the student to go to class and try not to miss class again, the teacher let Haejin go. Walking down the hallway, the boy thought it was very good that his class teacher was busy and didn't even look up at him. Looking at his hand, the lad thought it was best to do as the general told him, which was to be as careful as possible and not show his strength. At that moment, he remembered what his mentor had told him about the leading factions. They had deployed large-scale surveillance networks to track down street martial artists. And if they saw Park Jong-gun using his abilities, he would surely have been snatched, killed, or enslaved by now. That's why even after completing the training, you can't use your ki or attract unnecessary attention with your own, got it? The general said that night. But then Haejin realized that there was the biggest problem. He had grown a lot in 2 months, and it was impossible to hide that growth. In this case, anyone, even him, would be surprised to see such a transformation. Pulling his hood up, he decided that probably the best way was to try to blend in with the crowd as much as possible. Whether or not the plan would work, however, remained to be seen. He managed to get into the class without any problems. His first lesson in 6 months was Korean language. Tensely sitting on the back of his desk, he didn't realize if his plan was working or not. On the other hand, if no one has asked him about anything, then either the plan is working well or no one just doesn't care about him. Wang Taesan was asleep on the desk and paid no attention to Haejin. But at the same time, Woo Woo-han practically kept her eyes on the kid. Her ever-suspicious gaze followed the boy throughout the lesson. And it didn't seem like she was going to tell anyone about the changes that had happened to him. However, she looked at Haejin as if she originally knew everything and about everything. "What are you always looking at? Shit, study up!" the guy shouted, swinging his fists. But, as is often the case in such situations, it was all just thoughts. But he had won her over, at least in his expression. Lying on his arms and looking sadly at the desk, Haejin wondered if he just stayed here, would everything somehow work out? When all classes were over, the hallways were filled with dozens of students rushing about on various personal errands. A little cautiously, the hero looked out of the office and surveyed the aisles. There probably wouldn't be anything else going on today. Woo-ah-han watched him for a while, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. Heading towards the mirror, Haejin decided it was time for him to think about interviewing for a new part-time job, since he'd been out of work for 2 months now and had almost no money left. Looking at his reflection, the guy joked that with this appearance, he could already count on a position in the service industry. "Get that Band-Aid off your face!" A calm female voice came from behind me. Seeing Woo-ah-han behind him, Haejin recoiled and asked what she was doing here. The girl replied that she had some advice. After touching up her lips, she turned to the guy and said she didn't want to go into details about what had happened to him these past 2 months. Looking into Haejin's eyes, she mouthed that right now he'd better lay low for a while, as he was in far more danger than he could ever imagine.
Pet the cat.